Clemson Dubcast, the Wednesday, April 17th, 2019 edition. Hope everybody's having a great week. Great week over at TigerIllustrated.com. Of course, while some of us get to kick back a little bit after spring practice, I guess 10 days ago or so. Not so for Paul Strelo. He's busy as ever. Wednesday Insider Notes up right now as I speak. The latest on several five-star targets who will be on the road this weekend. More on Kobe Pryor and Christian Keeling. And plenty more from Paul, who's, as usual, doing a great job keeping everybody on top of all the recruiting coverage at TigerIllustrated.com. Want to give a special shout-out to the title sponsor of the Clemson Dubcast. Since all the way back in the beginning, way back in August of 2018, Parham Smith and Archenhold Law Firm, downtown Greenville. Blake Smith, he's been a good friend of mine for years, dating to the days when he taught a law class at Clemson with some guy named Terry Don Phillips. Back in this past July when I was sort of mulling over whether to do a podcast or not, just sort of tossing around the idea, thinking about possible sponsors, Blake and Brooke Archenhold were so enthusiastic to jump on board. So happy to have them with us then. And the same is true now. The forte of their firm, which is at 15 Washington Park in Greenville, is medical negligence. They represent patients and their families in medical negligence actions. They also handle all sorts of other personal injury litigation, free consultations at Parham Smith and Archenhold Law Firm. So give them a call at 864-990-4581 or go to parhamlaw.com. That's PARHAM law.com. If you're a business owner in Clemson, Greenville, South Carolina, the Southeast, anywhere, you probably want to hear about Tandem Payment and what they have to offer. If your business accepts credit cards, you probably need to see what these guys are all about. Tandem Payment, based right here in the upstate, changing the face of payment processing, quickly becoming the most cost-effective solution for all small businesses. Tandem's program, which is based on applying a small customer service charge to each transaction, ends up saving your business up to 90% of previous processing charges. One of the owners of Tandem is a 2005 Clemson grad. Instead of entrusting the majority of your hard-earned money to someone over the phone, you can meet face-to-face with the Tandem representatives and their consultative approach. So give them a call at 864-672-1570. or online at tandempayment.com. Okay, let's get to this week's interview with Ty Hildenbrandt of this Solid Verbal. Ty lives in Pennsylvania, so we weren't able to do our normal routine of visiting with our guests over at the Abernathy Boutique Hotel, but we plan to get back there in very short order. Wanted to remind you that the Abernathy Taps Bar and Cafe over there, they are looking for some of the old Taps yearbooks. They have plenty over there, but they're missing some. And so if you have one or some from back in the old days, give them a call over at the Abernathy, 864-654-5299. Ask for Gary Cohen or even drop by there. If you do have one that they're looking for, they'll give you some sweet discounts on a bar tab food over there at Taps Bar and Cafe. You can also find out more about the Abernathy online at theabernathy.com. All right, let's get to it. Our interview with Ty Hildenbrandt. Enjoy. All right, joined by Ty Hildenbrandt of the Solid Verbal. Man, it's great to finally have you on, Ty.
Larry, thank you for the invite. We've been trying to do this for 3 months now to make this happen.
Hey, it's hard to get both of our busy schedules on the synchronized, but glad to finally do it. All right, let's just start. I want to hear what you do for a living on the side, or I guess it's a full-time job. You have a full-time job, right?
I do have a full-time job. Podcasting is not, unfortunately, the only show in town for me. So, yes, I do a full-time job outside of what I do with the Solid Verbal.
And you live in Allentown, Pennsylvania, is that correct?
Yes, sir. I am in good old Eastern Pennsylvania. I am a Penn State grad, and I am from the area and now live in the area.
By the way, a mutual friend of ours just stopped by the house here in Clemson, actually. Travis Haney had said to say hello to you. Had great things to say about you. So
great.
He happened to be in the neighborhood. Do you mind me asking what you do? What your job is? What you do for a living?
So the mysterious day job has been a long-running question that I've gotten from people who listen to our show. All I can say, all I'm willing to say, is that it is not in podcasting, but it is in technology as a full-time gig. So it's sort of related to what I do with the podcast. But that's about as much as I can divulge.
Okay, interesting. I had no idea that this was a subject of such intrigue and mystery. So
well, here's the thing about it. I think if people really knew what it was, it would be far less interesting. But given the fact that it's been sort of a secret for many years now, we'll just keep the joke running and say it's in technology and go from there.
Okay, fair enough. All right, let's talk about the podcast. What are the origins of it? I mean, obviously now it's a fantastic and very popular podcast, but you had to start somewhere. Where did you start, and what's the story behind that?
Yeah, so back in 2008, I was writing a freelance college football column for SI.com. At the time, they had something called SI on Campus, which was their equivalent of like college sports. And Dan Rubenstein, my co-host, was doing a weekly video series where he would go out to some of the biggest games of the week, videotape the tailgating, the atmosphere surrounding a game, and they would post that to SI.com as well. So as I said, I'm a Penn Stater. Dan went to a Penn State-Ohio State game, and after seeing it, sent him a note saying, hey, we both do some work for the same website, wanted to just congratulate you on the job well done, really enjoyed the video. And that really sparked a conversation that lasted, I don't know, the better part of a year. At the time, podcasting wasn't nearly what it is now, and I had done podcasting quite literally before the word podcasting ever existed back in 2004 and 2005. So it was something that I was familiar with, and it was really starting to come into its own a little bit more as of 2008. So as Dan and I got to talking, we both had this desire to try and do a college football show. We just felt like there needed to be more options out there for people who were early to the podcasting scene. And so we started the Solid Verbal. We started the Solid Verbal in August of 2008, and really haven't looked back ever since. The show's grown a lot since then, and we've obviously, adapted to the changing ways of the podcast world. But by and large, that's sort of the origin story behind it all.
All right, I want to hear about, 2004. You said you had a podcast before they were even called podcasts. What did that consist of?
That consisted of, so first off, it was my co-host was my uncle, which I was fresh out of college at the time. It consisted of my uncle, and then once my cousin graduated, my cousin.
Did it consist of a basement as well?
It consisted of my old bedroom at my mom's house.
That's good enough.
Back from school, living at home. Our microphone at the time was an old gray Logitech webcam, which, as you know, I'm sure from doing broadcasting, first off, not the highest quality microphone, and secondly, anytime you would say what's considered a plosive, so like a P word where you've got that pop, the Logitech web camera was not great at dealing with those. So I was putting a white Hanes sock over top of the Logitech webcam and using that as our main audio input device. And we talked about the New York Yankees for about 4.5 years. We did a show, and it started where we figured out how to stream it to the few dozen people who knew how to tune into a live stream back in 2004. Eventually it became a podcast, something that we put out on a website that people could go out and download, that they could subscribe to. Again, the term podcast was just sort of coming about at that time, but to suffice to say, I was pretty early on the podcast movement.
I got to think back then that there were still a lot of people on dial-up.
There were people on dial-up. There were people listening to the show using an old program that I'm sure many of your listeners and you will remember called a Winamp. It was a much, much different scene. That was pretty much before iPhones and mobile devices became a thing and really turned podcasting up a notch. So it was a much, much different scene at the time. But the technology existed. It was still something that could be done. You just really had to work to make it happen.
All right. So you alluded to this a few minutes ago. 2008, 2009, 2010, you had the trajectory of podcasts. They became pretty popular, and then at some point came a descent. This is my sort of, understanding of it. Might not be accurate. I actually had a podcast back in 2009, 2010, and nobody would listen to it. Then in the last 4 or 5 years, they've just taken off again. And first of all, am I getting that timeline somewhat correct? Is that the way is that your sort of account of it as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, if I go all the way back to like 2004, 2005, this is really just when I think the methodology of podcasting was becoming a thing. It was just kind of in its infancy. And around the 2008, 2009 timeframe, that was when I stopped doing the Old Yankee Show and just focused primarily on the college football show. And at that point, mobile devices were really coming into their own. And that was what I would sort of consider. I don't know exactly the timeline for when podcasting became more accessible on mobile phones, but mobile phones have largely driven this podcast movement. So it wasn't until they became more readily available and how to get a podcast on a phone became easier. It wasn't until then that podcasting really took off. That was sort of like the first frontier. After we got past that, then the next big revolution, I think, was when higher quality content started finding its way into the public sphere a little bit more. On our front, we joined up for a season with Grantland.com, the old Bill Simmons site for ESPN, which had at the time the early makings of a podcast network where they had grouped a couple different shows together and put them all out on the same feed so that you could listen to all of them just by subscribing to one. And so more and more of those things started cropping up. And then if you really follow it down the line, a couple years ago, the dawn of Serial and some really high quality podcasts put out by some talented publishers, that I think is what brought it to where we're at presently, where podcasting is all the rage and the numbers are through the roof. Advertisers are much more engaged in what podcasting can do for them. So it's been an evolution here. I can't say that I thought it would ever get to this point, but the fact that we're still doing it and that the medium is thriving as it is, it's pretty exciting.
Can you tell me what a good episode, the numbers in terms of downloads would be?
Well, we're in a position, so I usually don't give out the exact number, not because I don't want to, but I would say we're healthily in the tens of thousands.
Gotcha. On
any given episode. And, that number tends to go up highest when we are in season, when interest is at its highest, generally the start of the season, when folks are getting ready for college football to begin. We do pretty well on rivalry weeks when, again, interest is peaked. And, generally you see something of a decline throughout the course of a season as teams lose and maybe fans lose interest. But certainly the weeks where you've got the biggest games and when you've got the most interest, that's when we see that number tick up higher than, weeks where maybe there isn't as much on the line.
Do you remember when you realized that you guys had something that really was catching on?
Yeah, I mean, when we joined up with Grantland, that was sort of the moment for me that it clicked like, holy cow, there are a lot of people listening to what we have to say. And to some degree, it kind of freaked me out. And I found myself relying a little bit more on stats to try and get all the information into a show, as opposed to, I think, beforehand where we leaned a little bit more on our personalities and our chemistry to do a show. Over time, I kind of figured that out, and it didn't bother me as much, but it was a bit of a culture shock initially to know that there were that many people, that many more ears listening to us than before. And, there have been things along the way that have been pretty cool milestones. It might not be as big and shiny as joining up with Grantland, but every time we get an email from like a serviceman who is somewhere abroad serving the country, it's incredibly redeeming to get that kind of feedback. Like, hey, I'm out in the front lines and I'm in a tank and I listen to you guys. Like, that's the kind of thing that I couldn't possibly have envisioned when we started doing this 10 plus years ago. So the big shiny stuff's easy, but the little tidbits you get along the way from people who listen, it serves as a constant reminder that what we're doing is something that people find value in, and that sort of makes it all worthwhile for us.
Now, Dan, what does he do otherwise? He does writing and stuff like that?
Dan does a little bit of everything on the sports media front. He was, obviously part of SI.com for a while doing the video thing. He joined up with SB Nation a couple of years ago and did, again, a little bit of everything on the sports media front, a lot of really creative video. And now he's sort of in a new chapter where he's doing a little bit of everything. He's able to work the podcast angle. He's able to work the video angle, a little bit of everything here and there, all kind of keeping his appetite sharp for new opportunities that might arise in sports media. But the thing about Dan that I'm fortunate that he's kind of my partner in this solid verbal endeavor is the creativity never stops with him. And he always has this app to keep the show fresh. And I think he and I playing off each other has really been the fuel that's made our show go for so many years now. So I'm fortunate to have him by my side as we do our show.
And he lives in New York?
He's in New York. Yep.
All right. So a lot of people will probably be bored to tears over this, but I'm curious that how you technically, do you guys do it over Skype? Like, how do you do the show when you're remote, I guess? Separated?
Yeah. So we're definitely not using the Logitech webcam at this point in time. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And over the years, I can't even tell you how many times, upgraded our equipment to try and produce the best sounding product. We might not have the biggest names of anyone doing a college football show, but our thought is always we can put the most into it and we can make sure that ours sounds the best. So what we do is we connect up via Skype, like a lot of shows do. But there was a moment maybe about 3 or 4 years ago when the Skype audio quality just went in the tubes. And whereas before we could record both sides of that conversation using Skype, we couldn't rely on it anymore. So what we'll do now is we've both got studio quality microphones in our respective studio setups, and I'll record my end, he'll record his end, and then I've got a reference track that I use on my side where I'll sync them up after the fact. People in the old audio days will call it a double ender, but really it just amounts to both of us recording our sides of the conversation, and then I'll sync them up after the fact before we publish out. So in effect, it sounds like we're in the same place, even though we're, in two different areas.
Have you ever lost a show? You mentioned Skype. I mean, there's a small percentage of times where it vanishes, I guess, from what I've read. Have you had any disaster stories like that where you have to retape a whole show?
We had a show. So we've been going to the national championship. Last year was the first year we did in a while, but we've been going to the national championship pretty much every year. And we had a show. I can't even tell you what it was about because I don't remember, but it might have been 2010 where we were in the same place. And at the time, equipment was not as portable as it is today. I was lugging out a big suitcase with all of this stuff that I could cobble together to create a portable studio. And something shorted out on us first at a show that, or while we were recording a show from our hotel room somewhere out in Phoenix. And it was one of the better shows we had done. I can't even remember what it was about, but something happened where we got this horrible electrical buzz in our recording, and the whole thing died. So that one we had to re-record. The other one that comes to mind that's a little bit more notable is a couple years ago, we were at the national championship, and we had done a video spoof while we were out in Phoenix about Tom Rinaldi. And this was a video clip that we did. It made it on SportsCenter. It really got a lot of people turned on to what we do. And we finally had an opportunity to talk to Tom Rinaldi. And so this is a big interview for us, for people who have been following the show and part of the show for years. Talking to Tom Rinaldi was kind of like a pretty big deal for us. It had a lot of significance. And I don't know if it was the interference in the room. I don't know the technical explanation for it. But we ended up having to scrap about half of that interview that we did with Tom Rinaldi because there was, again, a horrible electrical buzz that got recorded along with that show that it just made parts of that. You couldn't even understand. It was inaudible. So that was a bummer because that was a big moment for us. That was, almost permanently stricken from the record, but we were able to save some of it, and it was a great interview.
You said that Dan does such a good job of keeping things fresh and coming up with new ideas. What is the process for that? Like how far in advance do you guys plan for a show? Is it mainly over email, or do you talk over the phone? Is there sort of not a formula, but a format that you go by as you're planning each show?
Yeah, there's not so much a format. I'd say in general, Dan is super duper creative and always thinking way outside the box. And I guess my role is more of like a traditional host in the sense that I try to force things back in the box. And so that push-pull usually works pretty well for us. But as it relates to actually coming up with shows, we talk every day. Not usually on the phone, but online in some capacity. We're talking every day. We've always got an eye on what we've got to do next. It's harder in the off season because, as you know, there's not nearly as much to talk about. There's no games. There's no real expectation for what kind of college football content people even want at this juncture in mid to late April. So you're always trying to think of new ideas for what people might be interested in. And for us, the off season actually is when we go up the most in our downloads, where we bring the most, the highest number of new listeners into the fold because, we're among some of the only people trying new stuff in a college football sense. And, a lot of times it'll start with what's trending. So we did a show a couple weeks ago based on a Netflix series where a woman teaches people how to clean their house. And it's really popular. So we thought to ourselves, okay, how can we use that in a college football sense to put a different spin on something newsworthy? And so we tried it. It's a lot of trial and error. It doesn't always hit, but we're constantly thinking about what's at least in the public consciousness as something that is trendy and notable and something that we can talk about. And how might we be able to use that in a college football sense to at least give people a hook to check out the show if they're not familiar with what we're doing.
So I'm responsible for following one college football program. So there are these things called open dates, and for, say, a noon game, I can get home at 5 o'clock, and if I want to watch football, I can. If I want to go out to dinner with the wife, I can. You guys, it's a lot different. Are you just in front of the television all day, every Saturday of football season, and do you feel like you have to be? Yes.
In a word, yes. My wife has assured me that she doesn't hate me, but there are definitely Saturdays in the fall that she hates because, as you know, some Saturdays are much more intensive than others when it comes to college football action. Dan and I are in different positions. Even in his previous job, he could really write off watching college football and studying college football constantly as part of his day job. But I can't do that, being so I've got the mysterious day job that has nothing to do with college football. And so for me, I'm not as able to dive into the minutia the way I would really want to and feel comfortable to do a fully informed deep dive into college football. So I do my best with it. I'm constantly reading when I'm not watching college football, constantly reading what other smart people such as yourself have to say about programs that they follow with a degree of detail that I never could. So that's a big part of my research. On a Saturday, it's a lot of dropping into games. It's tough to watch any one unless it's a light slate of games. So I'm constantly dropping in to try and figure out what's going on, try and find the games when the momentum is swinging, when I can see a storyline unfold with my own eyes as opposed to reading about it on Twitter or, through an article after the fact. So Saturday is usually spent, I'll have a spreadsheet in front of me where I've got all the games, usually grouped by conference, and I'll go through and I'll jot down as much as I can about each particular game, each conference, and then the storylines that I think each of those games might shed a little bit more light on. So I'll do that, and then I'll wake up, God knows how early, on a Sunday morning to kind of put everything together and, make sure, at least this is during the season, that I know what I'm talking about when it comes time to record, usually at some time Sunday morning around like 9 a.m.
Okay, and then you guys release the podcast when? At the same time every week?
Yeah, we try to get it out pretty early on a Sunday. The problem with doing a college football show, especially one that is, and I'm sure a lot of folks who do football shows or baseball shows or any sports show really, we're at a disadvantage because everything is time sensitive. So our thought has always been we want to try and get our content out there as quickly as we can, because if we don't, we're costing ourselves downloads. Fewer people will have a chance to listen before it comes time to start thinking about next week. So usually try to get it out there as soon as we can. If we hustle, we can usually do it by noon, but in most cases it's 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
So not to pry too much into your family life, but I guess it's just understood that from late August to mid-January, no weekend trips or vacations or things like that. You're working. I mean, that's work.
It is a work day, although you do pick up some tricks along the way. And, I think there is some value in trying to live a normal life and still do this at the same time. There's an energy that you can bring to a show, a perspective that you can bring to a show, when you have to try and fit this in among all the other things that you do in a normal weekend. So yeah, I think there is some value in doing normal things like people who don't do a podcast and trying to mesh that perspective into the actual show. We have this thing on our podcast that we started a couple of years ago called the window of opportunity. And the window of opportunity really is, hey, there are big games this weekend. You want to watch them, but if you've got other things going in your life, when does it make sense for you to go out and do those things to fulfill all your family requirements and at the same time make sure that you're in front of a TV for the biggest college football games? And that idea, even though it might be a little bit hokey, was really born out of necessity because I found myself trying to look at a schedule and figure out the same thing. When can we go out and do things, my wife and I, in such a way that it's going to impact my ability to do a show the next day? So the window of opportunity is not just a hokey soundbite. It's something that I try to do so that, it's not all about work on the course of a given weekend, that you can go out there and live something of a normal life, as well. But it is tough. It's a challenge.
That's a fantastic idea because the large majority of your listeners are looking for that same window of opportunity. What do you think is the best idea you and or Dan have come up with as it relates to your show and its sort of presentation?
We started doing something called the Fantasy Things Draft a couple of years ago. And the premise behind it was, of course, fantasy football. Everyone knows what fantasy football is. You draft players to be on your team, and then you get points based on how that player performs. we decided that in a college football sense, we were going to draft storylines. We were going to draft narratives. We were going to draft things before the season that we thought would become bigger or a talking point as the season went on. So a good example would be last year, we had something called Strength Coach with a Screw Loose. And most strength coaches, let's be honest, have a screw loose. But that was a draft pick at our during our Fantasy Things show that Dan selected, and he laid out his whole rationale behind why he thought that would be more of a talking point and something that fans should be excited to hear on a Saturday. As it were, it ended up being a rather significant talking point. But a bunch of stuff like that, some serious, some not. We've been able to roll that into a live show, which we started doing some live shows where we did that one out in Chicago before a live audience. And I know we'll be doing that at some other location this fall. But the Fantasy Things show has really taken on a life of its own. And it gives us a chance to be really creative before the season, but also do so in a way that's not so inside baseball, that if you haven't been paying attention to what's going on all off season, you can still pick it up and listen to it down the road in the normal course of the preseason and not feel like you're left out.
Big supporter of Clemson athletics and now a loyal supporter of the Clemson Dubcast is Harris Flooring America. Based in Anderson, South Carolina, Harris Flooring has been instrumental in a lot of the facilities transformation you've seen on Clemson's campus lately. From the Allen Reeves Center to the McFadden Building to Memorial Stadium to the Neary Center, Harris Flooring has been at the ground floor, pun intended, of all this. Family owned and operated since 1947. The owner, Scott Junkins, big Clemson guy. He employs Clemson folks. And keep in mind, it's not just commercial. Harris Flooring is just as good inside the home and the residential realm as they are with the larger scale commercial stuff. Floor to ceiling design capabilities. Give them a call, 864-642-6183 or online at flooringamerica-anderson.com. Is there a time of year in general, I'm thinking like mid to late June, early July, where both you and Dan are like, I got nothing?
Yes. I can only speak for myself, but I go through pretty consistently a personal doldrums every year around the end of June, early part of July, right in that sweet spot, Larry, where it feels like, gosh, what are we possibly going to talk about? Why am I still even doing this show in June and July? Is anyone really interested in what we have to say? And to date, I haven't thrown into Cal yet, but there are absolutely those moments where you look at what's going on around college football, and it's just you're running on fumes, man, trying to come up with something new, some new angle that hasn't been explored, that that isn't hokey, that will still be interesting for people who are college football fans.
That's why I will never, ever be a sports radio host in charge of a 3-hour daily show. It's the summer has to be. I just don't know how they do it.
I don't know how they do it. I don't know how you have the energy to do it. And hot takes, of course, get a bad name. And believe me, I understand it. I'm not a hot takesy person myself, but certainly if you're in front of a microphone every day for 3, 4, 5 hours, and your job is to come up with something to say, I understand how hot takes just sort of happen organically, even if that's not your intention. There's just so little to talk about, and it's so hard to keep a conversation going that sometimes you almost have no choice.
All right, Ty, let's go back to November of 2014. I forgot the date, but Clemson loses at Georgia Tech. I believe that was their 10th game of the season. Deshaun Watson re-injured his knee in that game. Georgia Tech won pretty handily, 28-6, I believe the score was. What if I told you that day Clemson would proceed to win 58 of its next 62 football games and 2 national titles and close to another?
Yeah, I mean, look, a run like that is almost inconceivable. And it doesn't matter doesn't matter what team you're talking about. No one ever envisions, even in their wildest dreams, that they'll achieve that level of success. So what Dabo Swinney has done since then is nothing short of remarkable. I was looking through some of the numbers before hopping on here with you, and the run that they've had now over the last couple of seasons has been incredible. To see them rise as almost a counterbalance now to Alabama's dominance has been a joy to follow. And certainly the job that's going on down there at Clemson is, it's really exciting to watch from afar. It's incredible.
What was your take on Clemson 5-6 years ago, Clemson and Dabo?
Well, Dabo's always had the personality. And I think, just very generally speaking, from afar, I sort of wondered if it was like all hat and no cattle, if it was a show, if this guy who was very animated would ever find a way to put it all together in a championship sense. Of course, he's never been a bad coach. It's never been a bad program under him, but I wasn't sure if he would be able to bring it all together in the manner that he has. Now, clearly he's done that. And, gone are the days of the Clemsoning, which, I shouldn't say this on a Clemson show, but we had our fun with that for a while. But it became very apparent, certainly over the last couple of seasons, that those days are gone. That's a dirty word now that shouldn't be said anymore, because he has certainly built a juggernaut.
So you said you and Dan did not go to the to Santa Clara for the most recent national championship. I think I recall, in full disclosure, I was not optimistic about Clemson's chances either. I think neither of you were, or maybe it was Dan who was convinced that Alabama was going to win. Is that how it went?
Well, we both liked Alabama from the start, from the start of the year. I mean, I think we were both on the Alabama side of things. I don't think it was so much either of us believing that Clemson wasn't good enough to win. We both knew that they had the talent to compete toe-to-toe with Alabama, but it really truly is one of those things when you look at what Nick Saban's done, it's just hard to go against the grain. It's hard to go against that grain, knowing that Alabama's had so much success that, they're in this game all the time and they just know how to win it. It's a tough call to make, to go against that grain and say, we're going to give the nod here to a freshman quarterback. Clearly it worked out. It worked out in a big way. It got a little bit easier to go in the Clemson direction after seeing what Clemson did to Notre Dame in the playoff game. And still, a lot of people out there were justifying that as, well, Notre Dame just was overrated. What Clemson did was against an overrated team, and their real competition is going to come up against Alabama. I think we know in hindsight that's probably not the case. Clemson was just a buzzsaw. So, no, we weren't at the game. Dan was actually in the process of having his first child, which was the main reason why we couldn't go. Otherwise, we would have. But we certainly watched it from our perches over here on the other side of the country, and we were as blown away as anybody else.
I mean, how do you process that? That was unheard of going in, and really, I mean, most people thought, okay, if Clemson wins, it's going to be a close one, a lot like 2016. If Alabama wins, it could either be close or Alabama could stomp them, and yet Clemson does the stomping. I know for me the most surprising thing was Clemson was able to block a defensive line that it could not block the year before in New Orleans. What was the most, I guess, shocking thing to you?
Well, first let me rewind a little bit. I did a show with you maybe late November, early December, where we went through and talked in a lot of detail about Clemson. And you were pretty high. You were pretty high on Clemson then. You were really bullish on them. Obviously you're a wealth of knowledge when it comes to all things Clemson football, but I was really struck in that conversation with how, I think, good you felt relative to Alabama. Like, you knew the same thing that everyone else knew, but you probably knew it sooner, that this team had enough talent. And you were way higher on Trevor Lawrence than I think anyone else, because you knew just from talking to folks how special Clemson thought he was. And so you didn't really have that trepidation regarding him the way someone like Dan or I might have, just because you talked to people and you knew firsthand what they thought about him. So I kind of had that in the back of my head. And we always do this thing when we try to break down a championship game, like, what's the funniest possible outcome? What would be the weirdest possible outcome in this game? And of course the answer was always Clemson just going out there and just demolishing Alabama. And lo and behold, Clemson demolished Alabama. I was impressed truly with Trevor Lawrence. And I know it's probably the easy answer, but a freshman quarterback looking that comfortable in such a big spot. And I know we saw it the year prior with Tua Tagovailoa in the national championship in the second half, and he came in and ignited Alabama. But Trevor Lawrence burst onto the scene the way he had, to really not have any hiccups, that to me was just impressive. He's a once-in-a-generation quarterback who enjoy him for the 3 years he's at Clemson. He's going to have a long, prosperous career in the NFL. To see him on the biggest stage, a true freshman, perform the way he did was just remarkable.
We know about the reckoning that Nick Saban had to confront around the time of Cam Newton and Johnny Manziel and the spread tempo offenses, with playmakers at quarterback. Do you think that what happened in that game is imposing a similar reckoning for him and his style or how he recruits or anything?
Well, there's definitely a case to be made that the likes of Manziel, we saw it with Ole Miss, the system strained Nick Saban a little bit. It forced him to adapt to the extent where he's even running some of that stuff now as part of his offense. But I think it's a harder nut to crack with Clemson because it's a different kind of problem. It's different because Clemson is now recruiting on the same level. Whereas before he could go out there against an A&M or he could go out there against an Ole Miss. And even if the styles didn't match up perfectly with what he was trying to do on defense or offense, most of the time he had more talent. And over the course of 60 minutes, that would be shown pretty easily. But with the Clemson angle, it's different. Clemson is recruiting as well, if not better than anyone else in the country. And he can't play that same sort of game against them. So that's why it's really interesting to me to see what happens now moving forward. Clemson's lost, 4 games in 4 years, something crazy. They've won 2 titles in 3 years. This is a program that is clearly on the upswing. And I think as you look at how they project forward, they aren't slowing down anytime soon. That buzzsaw is not going to stop spinning. So it'll be really interesting to me to see how it progresses from here. If it does eat a little bit more into that dominance that we've seen from Alabama, just because Clemson, they're just reloading now. They've reached critical mass. They're getting the talent year in and year out. And, it's apparent after what we saw in the championship that going toe to toe with Alabama and beating them handily is something that they can do.
I've asked a few recent guests on the podcast this. I'll put you on the spot. I need a number. In the next 5 years, how many more national titles does Clemson win?
Well, it's tough to see beyond the arc of Trevor Lawrence. Could they win 2 with Trevor Lawrence? Yeah, absolutely. He's going to be the best quarterback in college football. So I would say at a minimum 1. I think most people would take that. Now, will Clemson people take that at this point after having won 2 in such a short span of time? You would be better equipped to answer that than me. But the answer is at least 1 for as long as he is in Clemson, because I think, and you know this, on the college football level, if you've got a transcendent player such as Trevor Lawrence, that player can take you to new heights. He really, truly can. So let's play it safe. I'll say at least 1, but certainly with the base of talent that Dabo Swinney has brought into town, it could certainly be much higher.
Who would have thought that you'd be risking getting hate emails from Clemson fans for predicting only 1 national title over the next 5 years?
Let me ask you. Let me flip it around to you. What do you think is a reasonable expectation based on the talent you see coming in outside of Trevor Lawrence, outside of some of the names that we came to know and love over the last year?
So I had last week I had Matt Connolly, who covers Clemson for the state newspaper, on, and I asked him the same question. I believe he said 2.5 as the over/under. And now look, you're not covering this. You're not paying as much attention to recruiting. They have another quarterback who they feel really good about getting, the number one quarterback in the country from California, DJ Ungalele. Yeah.
Right.
And then you also have two more receivers on campus right now who look a lot like Justin Ross and T. Higgins, in Joseph Ngata and Frank Ladson, who Dabo says are as ready as any freshman he's ever had. And so, what the casual, I'm not saying you're a casual observer, I'm just saying what the casual observers nationally don't realize when they say, oh my gosh, they have, 2 more years of Trevor Lawrence and Justin Ross and another year of T. Higgins and Travis Etienne. They don't really realize that they are already reloading. And I'm not saying that DJ is going to be as good as Trevor Lawrence. That's a high bar and probably unfair, but he's pretty good. And so I think reasonable 2, 3 not out of the question for the next 5 years. I hope I don't sound like too much of a homer.
I think a reasonable over-under is probably 2 over the course of 5 years. Again, knowing that the system has gotten to that critical mass point where it's essentially recruiting itself. A question that we ask a lot, and I'll put you back on the spot on our show, is what would it take to stop the momentum? Obviously, using Alabama as an example, for a lot of schools, if you have such amazing turnover with your coaching staff, that can throw a monkey wrench in the works. That has not happened at Alabama. Nick Saban's been able to hold that ship together. So whatever eventually stops their momentum, and might be Saban retiring, at a minimum, we know it's not coaching staff turnover. What would it take to slow that momentum at Clemson at this point, knowing that it is essentially recruiting itself?
Something infecting their culture that they have, entitlement, the wrong kinds of personalities in your locker room, thinking that it's going to be easy. But the easy answer to that is, man, Dabo and that staff do such a good job of fighting against that. And they've done a great job already of it. I mean, they've had plenty of reason to sit back and feel fat and happy and pat themselves on the back. And man, Dabo does such a great job of manufacturing that chip on the shoulder. It's still there, and I guarantee you he's going to find a way to create it this year. It'll probably be in the form of, there will be some people out there who are picking Alabama to win it all. And so they'll feel disrespected again. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. These coaches are enormously happy here. Brent Venables is he's starting his 8th season in Clemson, and he's probably the best assistant in the country. I don't think there's any doubt about that after he held that Alabama offense to 16 points. I mean, that is incredible to do that. So I don't know. A meteor hitting Clemson, I don't know. Maybe I have no idea, but it's hard to see. It's hard to see anything slowing them down right now.
And the other thing that I think Clemson has going for it's not an Alabama situation, and I mean this with no disrespect to the ACC, because I love watching ACC football, but the ACC is not the SEC West, where it feels like there is more of a lingering threat from week to week that someone could knock you off if they're playing their game. If you look at Clemson's schedule, there are only a few landmines this year. Most of those games are at home. They've got A&M, second week of the year. That'll be a measuring stick, but probably more so for A&M's defense. They've got Florida State at home after a bye in mid-October, and Florida State's got their own issues now, notably at quarterback. And they've got a road game later in the year against South Carolina, which is a rivalry I know you've written extensively about. Otherwise, though, you're kind of squinting to find a letdown game, a look-ahead spot where maybe someone could jump up and get Clemson. But it's sort of like that for the foreseeable future. I think that also lends itself pretty nicely to a continued run here from Clemson, just knowing that, I like the ACC. It's a good conference. Those threats, those landmines aren't there to the same degree they might be in a conference like the SEC West.
I totally agree. And look, can the ACC be really good at times? Absolutely. In 2016, Clemson's schedule, getting past Lamar Jackson and Florida State with some ridiculous talent, Dalvin Cook and a number of players. That was a tough schedule for them that year. But you also have years like this past year when not a whole lot of resistance. And I've always said, Clemson has such a, well, not always, I've said recently, Clemson is in a perfect spot in the ACC because you have, how many schools in the ACC do their fans spend 365 days thinking, we got to get better in football, versus the SEC, where you always have that, just that determination to be better and to win. And so I agree with you. And, I'm sure, this seems like decades ago, but I'm sure you remember when, I guess back in 2011, 2012, when, realignment hysteria was
Sure.
sweeping the nation. And, the rumors about Florida State and Clemson leaving for the Big 12 were rampant. And I think there was actually people reporting that they were leaving. And there were so many Clemson fans and Florida State fans saying, man, we got to go. This conference is terrible. And I'll never forget Dabo just saying, this is crazy. He said, we have everything we want to achieve is available to us in the ACC. And I remember the chairman of the Board of Trustees, David Wilkins, back then told me, he said, Larry, here's what we need to do. We need to focus on dominating the ACC, and everything we want will be achievable. And darned if both of those men weren't right when, they were going against the grain back then with those opinions, but they look pretty smart now.
Yeah, and they look smarter when they go out there and they demolish ACC competition. You could say what you want about the overall conference strength, but something that I look at is how easily are you beating your competition? Not by what margin, but are you beating a team easily, or are you struggling with that competition? Now, everyone's going to have a hiccup here and there, but by and large, second half of the season last year, Clemson dominated their opponents in the ACC. And that to me was meaningful. That to me shows a team that has a killer instinct that's going to go out there against whoever they play, and they're going to put their best foot forward, that they're playing with intensity. If they can continue to do that, I don't suspect they'll stop anytime soon. Not only does that lend credibility to Clemson, but it lends credibility to the whole notion that they could go on another great 5-year run.
When does the Clemson fatigue? When do the cries of Clemson fatigue start if this keeps up?
Well, so here's the thing. We talked about Alabama, and we talked about this budding rivalry now between Clemson and Bama. If Clemson's rise happened to any other team at any other point in college football history, I think it will be far easier to paint them as a villain. But now, as a counterbalance to Alabama, they're kind of easier to root for. Like, if you played a game of word association, and if you asked people, what comes to mind when you think of Alabama? My guess is you're going to get words like dominant. You're going to get words like unstoppable, but you're also going to get words like machine. You're going to get words like soulless, villain,
Death Star.
Right? Sure. But for Clemson, sure, you're going to get dominant and unstoppable, but you're also going to get words like fun. And that is in such stark contrast to what we see at Alabama that it makes them easier to root for. I think it's harder to get tired of them, just because if you're picking between the two giants in college football, why not root for the team that at least seems like they're having a little bit more fun out there and pull for the Clemson Tigers? And that might not be a fair characterization, but at least the end of it that we've seen doing a national show over the span of this great run by Nick Saban and now Dabo Swinney, that seems to be the general sentiment. Like, I'd rather root for the team that seems like they're having more fun than essentially the pro team down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, that seems like they're very corporate and NFL-y and, more of a machine.
Is there another team out there on the radar that not only you think could be good enough to challenge this duopoly, I guess, but also could be, I guess, as marketable as Clemson and as fun and all that stuff that we're talking about?
It's tough from the fun perspective. The closest, I guess, facsimile would be Georgia, because I think Georgia under Kirby Smart is really revving up, and they're also bringing in the talent. They're also knocking on the door of sort of being that next giant in college football. Kirby Smart, as you know, does not necessarily have the Dabo Swinney personality. So they might be lacking in that department, but certainly not on the talent side. It's tough to get up to that next echelon where Clemson and Alabama find themselves right now, and there are scant few teams at this point in time that really are anywhere close, maybe outside Georgia.
Does the 2018 Clemson team have a case for being the best in college football history, just given that a lot of folks said during the season that Alabama looked like the best, possibly the best team in college football history?
Well, certainly elements of the Clemson team are in that conversation. What they did along the defensive line was dominant. It was completely dominant. All four of those guys are going to play in the league. They've got their work cut out for them, replacing them this coming year. But that defensive line, to put that together on the college football level is pretty impressive. Certainly what transpired out at the wide receiver position, I don't think we've seen that peak yet, because they were young in their wide receiving core and they retained their quarterback this coming year. My guess is that we're going to see higher highs from them at some point in the next, season or two. So I wouldn't go there quite yet on that front, but just overall, what Clemson did on the defensive side of the ball, not just on the defensive line, it's probably in that conversation. So I always stop short of making the grand historical reference, just because I generally think I'm a dummy with all things college football and putting it in perspective like that. But it's certainly along the line, it was damn impressive.
Ty Hildenbrandt, man, you've been very generous with your time during a busy time during the week. So really, really appreciate you finally coming aboard, and great conversation, man.
Thank you for the invite. I'm glad we could finally do this.
Likewise.
And, Dan wanted me to say hello. We're both huge admirers of your work. You do an awesome job. I have your book here in my bookshelf.
Oh, fantastic. I was going to ask
Travis Haney may have sent me at some point. I'm looking at it right now. So we appreciate all the good work you do, keeping us in tune with all things Clemson. And we'll have to make sure we have you on our show at some point in the build-up to the new season.
Anytime. Did you get a copy of the recent book, the Dabo's Dynasty book?
I don't have the Dabo book. I have the Clemson, South Carolina book.
Okay, I'll get this one sent to you ASAP.
All right. Awesome.
Thank you, Ty. Great time.
Take care.
All right, you too. All right, thanks to Ty Hildenbrandt for sharing his story. Boy, starting from scratch way back in 2004. It's really cool to hear how that all took shape. So thanks to Ty for joining us. Thanks also to our sponsors, title sponsor, Parham Smith & Arch & Holt Law Firm in downtown Greenville. Also in Greenville, Tandem Payment in Anderson, Harris Flooring America. And also, don't forget the Abernathy Taps Bar and Cafe. They still got my favorite over there on tap, Hugie Street IPA. We've officially adopted that as our official interview beer that we drink while we're conducting interviews, except interviews that occur before noon. That's a little too early. Anytime after noon, though, this time of year, fair game. All right, everybody, have a great rest of the week. We'll be back next week. Stay tuned.